Come avete sentito abbiamo bisogno noi di feedback, viviamo di feedback, quindi abbiamo veramente piacere di ascoltare tutto quello che avrete voglia di condividere con noi. Questa è una persona in Techogym che è deputata a tutti voi, a rispondere alle vostre domande. Seconda cosa, avete un cartellino con un bollino colorato, questo è per il pranzo. Visto che siamo 400 persone, a ora di pranzo verrete divisi in due gruppi. Il primo gruppo, quello col bollino rosso, accederà al ristorante aziendale da queste porte qui laterali, mentre l'altro gruppo potrà venire con il personale Techogym in palestra e noi saremo molto lieti di rispondere a tutte le domande sui vari prodotti che sono in palestra. E come avete potuto vedere anche dal video, more to come, c'è di sopra un prodotto in esclusiva mondiale che vi preghiamo la cortesia di non fotografare perché non l'abbiamo ancora lanciato sul mercato, ma che è ovviamente a vostra disposizione per eventuali prove, eventuali domande. Abbiamo del personale dedicato che sarà a vostra disposizione per rispondere a tutte le domande del caso. Questo è quanto, io ringrazio e lascio la parola al Costantino. Buona giornata.
A mia volta invito, grazie Marco, invito il Presidente federale Luigi Bianchi.
Buongiorno a tutti. Ringrazio Mira Alessandri di ospitarci in questa bellissima sala, in questo luogo di eccellenza italiana, un luogo di sport, un luogo dove non si fa solo sport ma si fa cultura, si fa scienza, si fa studio. Sono venuto qui circa un anno fa a visitare l'azienda, a parlare un po' del triathlon e di quello che poteva essere l'aggancio con un'azienda così importante come la Techogym e sono stato chiaramente, come qualsiasi persona che entra qui per la prima volta, impressionato dall'azienda e dalla qualità che dà questa azienda anche ai suoi dipendenti. E l'idea è stata subito di venire, vedendo questa sala, la prima cosa che ho pensato era quella di venire qui a fare il nostro convegno tecnico-scientifico, perché solitamente si va in alberghi che non hanno un'anima sportiva, quindi la scelta era stata proprio voluta, anzi ringrazio ancora Techogym di esserci stata vicina e di averci ospitato in questa bellissima sala. Prima si parlava di cultura di sport, di scienza, di ricerca e oggi si parlerà di questo, si parlerà di dove va il triathlon dal punto di vista tecnico con importanti relatori, a iniziare dal nostro Olympic Performance Director Joel Figliol, ma seguiranno anche il responsabile della parte fisica Miota, il dottor Fabio Fantoni, il medico federale, più tutte le altre persone che parleranno quest'oggi, non trascurando ogni particolare. Ci sarà l'azienda Dorelan che è il nostro sponsor, che parlerà anche dell'importanza del riposo, del recupero, quindi tutti argomenti che serviranno per accrescere la cultura dei tecnici, che altro non sono che i professori che uno trova a scuola. Quindi se noi avremo dei bravi allievi è perché avremo avuto dei bravi tecnici importantissimi nel formare i ragazzi, soprattutto a un livello giovanile, dove oltre a insegnare a essere dei bravi sportivi bisogna soprattutto insegnare a essere dei bravi cittadini, e questo è correlato con quello che poi diventeranno da grandi anche nello sport. Quindi sono molto felice di essere qua, ringrazio ancora veramente Alessandro di averci ospitato, perché penso che sia il luogo adatto. Si parlava di outdoor, indoor, sicuramente c'è collegamento, sicuramente la palestra è sempre stato un luogo di allenamento anche per i nostri triatleti, per la cosiddetta preparazione a secco, no? Nel senso, non si può andare tutto l'anno in bicicletta, bisogna usare anche del materiale. Techogym ha un ottimo prodotto, mi sembra, che già usano molti nostri triatleti. Quindi oggi è un giorno importante per noi, un inizio, spero che questa collaborazione con Techogym possa continuare. Che dirvi, vi auguro un buon lavoro, io sarò qui tutto il giorno, quindi ci sarà anche modo di scambiare qualche opinione, sulla vostra disposizione, ma adesso direi che è ora di partire con questo importante convegno. Lascio la parola a Costantino Bertuccelli, responsabile del settore tecnico, che ringrazio, perché anche se siamo qui in tutta l'organizzazione insieme all'ufficio marketing Davide Dell'Erba, quindi ringrazio per il lavoro svolto e gli lascio la parola e quindi auguro a voi una buona giornata. Grazie a tutti.
Grazie Presidente, io finisco di tirare questa lunga volata agli speaker più main speaker di oggi e contrariamente a quello che si fa di solito io comincio con la slide che di solito si mette alla fine di qualsiasi presentazione e mi rivolgo a voi con il termine you all'inglese, quindi non esiste un voi ma esiste un tu, ok? Io vi ringrazio e ti ringrazio perché da una parte conosco gran parte di voi e ne sono stato e ne sono testimone della vostra crescita formativa. Siete veramente tanti, siete bellissimi da qui e permettetemi un pizzico di orgoglio del nostro settore di istruzione tecnica che ha lavorato tanto tempo e con cuore per offrirvi questo tipo di opportunità. Un genio del nostro paese ha declinato il concetto di obiettivo in questo senso e a me piace veramente tanto. Il più grande pericolo per noi non è che miriamo troppo in alto e non riusciamo a raggiungere il nostro obiettivo, ma che miriamo troppo in basso e lo raggiungiamo. E questo credo si integri bene poi con i concetti che Joël Filiol vorrà trasmettervi sulla cultura del lavoro. Siamo in una location di eccellenza italiana. Credo che strutture di questo genere non ce ne siano tante in Italia e quindi vorrei che da oggi tutti noi prendessimo ispirazione per diventare noi stessi eccellenza. Siamo persone rivolte all'educazione, alla formazione e allo sviluppo e quindi siamo nel posto e nel momento giusto. Spesso il problema è dove mettere le mani. Ci sono tante informazioni rispetto a quando io ho iniziato a fare questo mestiere, che dovevi andare nelle librerie, nelle biblioteche a prenotare libri. Oggi c'è un'enorme quantità di dati e quindi il problema è diventato di dove mettere le mani. Pensate che se ogni giorno si scrivesse su un testo, su un libro, tutti i messaggi che a livello digitale ci scambiamo, email, avrebbe una colonna di libri più alta dell'Everest. Quindi il problema non è la quantità di dati, il problema è la qualità e il loro significato. Ecco quindi che mi piace introdurre questa giornata con il concetto di organizzazione dell'apprendimento e di condivisione tra exploitation e exploration, quindi non solo continuare a fare meglio ciò che già so fare, ma spingerci su territori di innovazione. E quindi questo concetto diventa l'ambidestrismo, riuscire a unire entrambe le cose, ed è l'ambidestrismo che ci permette e ci ha permesso in passato, attraverso il pensare a nuove tecniche, il pensare a nuovi strumenti di lavoro, di fare dei salti qualità anche nello sport a livello prestazionale. Quindi il passaggio da una tecnica all'altra vedete come ha inciso in maniera fondamentale sul miglioramento della performance. Ovviamente parliamo di salto in alto. Mi piacerebbe che iniziassimo a ragionare dal punto di vista della consapevolezza in questo senso, quindi iniziare a domandarci nella nostra crescita culturale, partendo dal gradino di base, e avere la consapevolezza a quale step siamo, cosa ho lasciato e cosa mi aspetta nello step successivo. Augurandovi buona giornata, vi lascio, sapete che io amo le contaminazioni sportive, quindi vi lascio con un personaggio degli sport motoristici e mi piace molto questa sua frase che si adatta molto allo sport e al triatleta, cioè non devi mai pensare di essere arrivato, non deve mai essere troppo confortevole quello che stai facendo, perché significa che stai già rallentando. È con grande piacere che invito Joël Filiol alla prima relazione della giornata. Prego, ti cedo il palco. Buona giornata di nuovo.
the presentation. First, thanks very much for everyone coming, and it's fantastic to see so many coaches here. I don't think I've ever seen so many coaches in one room, so well done to the community for all of you being part of coaching, part of the journey and the process, and joining us here today. I'm going to try to speak really slowly, one, because of course the translation, and then of course because not everyone can process English as fast as I can. I have two talks today. The first one about training and what I've learned about my experiences in performance and the principles. And the second more what I've learned in the last year about our culture here and how we take the next steps forward. I always find these talks really useful to formulate in my own mind what exactly I need to achieve clarity on. So I appreciate the opportunity to put those thoughts and to present them to you, and indeed speaking with all of you over the course of the day. So we put the slides in Italian. I'm going to read from some English slides, but this is really the principle here. What is world-class triathlon preparation? High-level preparation, what is that? Do we understand what that means, and what does that mean for our athletes as coaches? No matter what level you're on, from development junior all the way up, there's a pathway that if we can see where our athletes need to go, then we can start right from the very beginning. And it's really what I've learned along the way. This is, if you don't know me or about me, I won't read it all, but developed in Canada, and this guy here, Simon Whitfield, one of two-time Olympic medalists, was a huge influence on me. And a lot of what I talk about today actually comes from our work together into Beijing, where he won the second medal of his career. A lot of what you may know me now, if you know me, is from my most recent experience from the London cycle to the Rio cycle. And that's really where I transformed all of these experiences into the success we've had, culminating with our second senior world champion this year with Mola. And it's from those experiences that I want to share with you today. And I always say that it's the athletes that teach me what I know, and then I want to share that with the coaches. The athletes have been the biggest influence on my own development. We're quite a young sport. We don't have a long history. So we have these different opportunities we can learn from each other, but I want to share what I've learned from these guys. So from world champions, Olympic medalists, top performers, what can we learn about how they do things and apply that here? They're not different than our athletes for the most part. They're not different. Some behaviors and attitudes can be different. And these are the principles I want to talk about today. And a lot of these kind of conferences, you think, I want to know about training and key sessions and what workouts we do. I talk a very small part about that because it's really not the important stuff. That's not where champions are coming from. My training sessions are not more interesting or different than yours, really. It's how we put them together, but most importantly, these principles. And I would put these in, order of importance. I would say that's why I wrote them on there. Attitude, number one. By far, if there's one thing that we can change, what I want you to take away from today, it's our attitude, and it fits well with the first two introductions that we've had. the biggest single difference is the attitude of the athletes. And we have to spread that all through the community. Coaching, that's why we're here. The choice of a coach is the most important decision, I think, that the athletes make in their career. And it's our role then, you see the responsibility that comes with that, but our role is transformational for athletes. The third is environment. What surrounds our coaching, our athletes, the other athletes, our behaviors. And finally, preparation, of course. Preparation does make a difference, and there are some subtleties that I want to talk about that I've learned. Commitment is an important word, I think, for a performance point of view. It's very easy to say, I want to go to Olympics, I want to go to Tokyo, for example, as we're in the Tokyo cycle. But what are we going to do about it? What behaviors are we going to take in order to meet that expectation? It's very easy to talk about, I want to be an Olympic champion, world champion. But coming back to the behaviors that we see the top athletes are doing are fundamentally different than the behaviors of lower level athletes. I really like to think about sport as about choices. It's not about, I really don't like to use the word sacrifice for sport. If you're doing sport as a high-level sport person or as a coach, we've made a choice to do it. It's not a sacrifice. And those choices, the choices we make, are the difference between winning and not, oftentimes, coming back to attitude. Do the work. It's very hard to be the best. It's a lot of work, a lot of commitment, and I think we need to make sure that all of our athletes, and indeed ourselves, understand what that means, what the work is, what does it look like, what does it feel like through the year and through over years. Because one of my observations are the simple things we can do, we do need to do more. We have to work harder. Comes back to attitude, but connecting that to behavior, we've got to work harder. So high level, and this last word, I don't know how it translates in English, relentlessly obsessed. Being a high-level sports person, a world champion, is not about living a balanced life. It's about being totally focused on one goal, and everything you do is connected to that goal. Every part of your life. We talk about an athlete being 24/7, 365, right? Every day, all day. Everything you do is connected to that. And that's something I think we can transmit all the way up. Of course, we're not talking a junior athlete to be like this all the time, but they have to understand what it takes and how do you move through as you develop. But that obsession, I think, is important, and that's a critical difference between the best and the rest. You might have seen this picture before. Alistair Brownlee, when he's, 12, 13. But look at the look on his face. You could probably predict then that he was going to be great. And in fact, I remember when I started in Britain, working there, somebody asked me, what do you think of Alistair's race in Athens? Beijing, if you watched the Beijing Olympics. Maybe many of you, it's not fresh in your mind. But if you go back and watch, you'll see he was leading the run for quite a long time in the run, and he was maybe just out of junior. Is that right? At first I thought, it's not a very wise tactic that, because he ended up 12th, I don't remember exactly, not in the medals. But what I came to realize later about Alistair is his attitude, this face, these principles, ruthlessness, fearlessness, mental toughness, coolness under pressure, and his total focus on the goals demonstrated themselves at a very early age. And we can say, one, is he a product of his environment, or was he like that already? But one important thing that people around Alistair realized very early was don't try to change that about him. This is, at certain times in the Beijing Games, maybe it's not so wise. but later it proved to be the difference that made him the athlete that he is. He is not more talented than other athletes, but his attitude is what separates him. And we can learn something about that. This is one of my favorite quotes from really one of the pioneers of endurance coaching of running, of Arthur Lydiard. And I totally believe it. This is on my website, it's a mantra. Of course, it's in English. Champions are all around us. All we have to do is train them properly. And it's a message, I think, for everyone is there really is the talent that we think we desire, that we often look at other countries, oh, they have more talent. They do not. But we have the power to take the athletes around us and turn them into champions. So I'll talk about the role of the coach. The first part, this is, again, attitude, the coaching environment. So the first principle, I think, is do the basics very well. A lot of my messaging is really simple, because that's been my journey over coaching. I started sports science in school, and I reached the point where I get simpler and simpler all the time. And the basics to me are these things here. I think there was this theme of this in maybe your conference last year, but this concept of relationships and communication. If we want to get the best out of our athletes, in fact, of any of us, we have to be able to understand each other, communicate with each other, and understand how we're motivated and driven. If there's one thing that high-performance coaching is that, relationships and communication. The technical knowledge now, with the internet and the free movement of information, is accessible to everyone. Everybody in this room can look up what top athletes do around the world in different sports. But that doesn't mean everybody can then develop their athletes into champions. So I always come back to this. In our curriculums for coaching, and indeed, particularly I say high-level coaching, we should spend more time on this than probably anything else, more than methodology, more than physiology. The better we understand that, the better we're going to be able to work with our athletes. The second part is methodology conditioning. And over time, I've done more individualization, more considering the day-to-day adaptation. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. But if there's one message reinforcing, it's that generally the best conditioned athletes are the most consistent performers. And that's really accessible to us. It's simple. It's not a complex formula. The best conditioned athletes are winning races. And when we understand that, then we can apply that to our preparation. The longer I've been coaching, the more patience and progression, piano has become really a critical message for me. The biggest mistakes I've made in my coaching is when I did not follow patience and piano. I can think of key moments where I didn't trust myself, my instincts, and made mistakes. And usually those mistakes come back to injuries or health problems. And when you enter that cycle, it can be very difficult to exit. The best way to not be injured is to not get injured in the first place. The 99%. I say that because it's very popular in current high-performance sport to be really interested in the very small things. And so I like to go counter to that, because in my experience, most of us don't come back to the first point, the basics right. We make mistakes at the very first step, and then we're trying to get sophisticated or innovative. If we don't do the basics right, it doesn't matter how many fancy recovery methodologies we use, or if our athletes are not motivated, or if they're not in the right environment, we have to get that basic stuff right. I'm going to talk about what the basics are in more detail, but high level. And the other point, the last point on here, is I think the role of the modern coach, if you like, because information has been democratized, everyone has access to information, is to behave like a filter. We don't want our athletes to be confused or overcomplicate things, and even for us, we should treat information about training with a degree of skepticism about what we implement. Otherwise, we create a very complex environment that perhaps is not the truth of what it takes to be successful. So I've taken this off the British Triathlon website, but I really agree with this way of looking at the role of the coach and the principles of the coach. And you can see over time how the role of the coach, athlete, and indeed parent changes. And if I go right to podium, you can see that the athlete becomes more the leader of their program. And indeed, that's what we want. Those are the characteristics of champions. And the role of the coach is not diminished, but they're not necessarily the leader in the same way that they are at younger levels. The important part is that we're preparing our athletes for this journey. Because what we see often is athletes who arrive, perhaps they're not at podium, literally podium, but they arrive at a senior age without the skills to manage themselves, without the ability to manage their training, competitions. They need their handheld all the time. And this is something I'm sure you can reflect. Many of our athletes today do not have the skills to manage themselves in the same way that champions do. And that comes from how they develop. If we don't teach them how to do that, they won't learn. And in fact, that I think is one of the key messages, is we have to let them fail sometimes. We have to let them learn how to do it. And in our desire to support athletes, we can support them too much. And I think that's, when I talk about culture later, that's going to be a big thing that comes back again and again, a big principle. Too much support does not help our athletes develop. And we have to learn to let go of that. We have to let go. We have to push them out into the world so that they can manage themselves. So these principles, engagement, that means they're an active participant in coaching and their program. They're not being told what to do, they're actively engaging. What's the session today? How should I do it? What feedback do I want? What am I aiming to get out of the training session? This next point, earned collaboration, is important. You have to earn the ability to manage your own program. I think a mistake many coaches make is we give too much ownership at young levels when they don't really know anything yet. So perhaps it's maybe think of that process of how do we teach management, self-ownership. We don't give it to them right away, it's a progression. And I say earned collaboration. You have to earn the right by demonstrating good decisions, good management, in order to be the king or queen of your program. Ownership, this is a big principle that we're talking about all the time. We want the athletes not to be, again, told what to do. They need to decide their path, and we guide them and lead them. Okay, it changes through that process, but they've got to own what they're doing, who their coach is, what environment they're in. And finally, athletes and coaches, we need this principle, of course, of leadership. The point I put this on here is thinking about the athlete needs to be able to be a leader. What is the principles, again, the characteristics of a champion? They're leaders. They're not followers, the athletes, right? And we can help them along that process. The daily coached environment. We've talked strategically, but I want to say to everyone that this environment when we talk about squads, training, what does that mean? The point that I want to take out of this paragraph of words is together it's easier to do the work necessary to be great. Collectively we're better than when we're by ourselves or individuals. And that daily training environment, I talk about a lot, and I live it. It is just so important to trying to be the best. There are very few athletes that can do it by themselves or with one athlete and one coach. We know generally who they are, but they're the exception to the rule. And we shouldn't operate based on the exception to the rule. Because if you have to ask if you're the exception, you're not the exception. You know it already. The power of that environment are the adjustments, modifications, observations, and reflections. I think that's the art of coaching. And doing that in person every day is how we navigate that process of health, progression, and performance. And that's why we're pushing strategically to have more of our athletes in those environments where they see their coach every day, and we make those kind of adjustments. When the athletes are on camp, they don't follow the plan that we wrote necessarily. It's just a guide. But we have to be free and flexible to adapt based on what we see. Optimize, if you like. And so the guiding principles of environment, this balance between challenging athletes and supporting athletes. I think we need to challenge our athletes more. Our athletes are very well supported. They need to be challenged more. And in fact, we have to challenge ourselves more. The individualization with the group in the environment, more and more I'm doing this, different programs in the same group. Athletes are not following exactly the same training schedule just because they're in the same squad. They have different programs, but collectively we're working in the same direction. Self-management, talked about decision-making. This is highly connected to attitude, but the ability of our athletes to make good decisions, and indeed us, is a big differentiator between being successful or not, making mistakes and avoiding making mistakes. The quality of our decisions, how that's connected to our strategy. Athlete-coach partnership, relationship, communication, we've talked about. So now transitioning a little bit into preparation. Maybe some of these concepts are hard to connect to behaviors. But we'll talk a little bit about preparation now. So what's really important? And these are the things I've learned over time to make it as simple as possible. I said before, conditioning. What does that mean? It means fatigue resistance, strength not lifting weights, but the ability to avoid slowing down, the ability to do a lot of training, to absorb a lot of training. Despite the focus on being fast, being skilled, the athletes that are winning the races are the ones that are there close to the finish. And the differentiator is actually just being simply as fit and conditioned, as strong as possible. And it's a very accessible thing for all of us because it's actually not difficult to make a program that's designed towards that. It's very simple. Consistency, every coach talks about consistency. How do you do it comes back to decision making and the focus of your program, but we know that we want to have as few interruptions in training over a long period of time. It may be obvious, but we have to orient our decision making around that to avoid causing problems that are otherwise avoidable. The athletes that I work with are very rarely injured because I'm not afraid to make decisions to do a little bit less or to modify very early in the process so we avoid having these interruptions. Now, injuries are not totally avoidable in high-performance sport, but we should tend toward trying as much as possible to avoid these interruptions. And consistency also connects to choices about competitions, which we'll talk about. And finally, this principle of the right load at the right time. Treat each athlete as an individual. You're going to choose the right training load, the right stress, at the right time. So even if your program says they're meant to do a training session, if you can see that they can't do it or shouldn't do it, that's when we make a decision, we make an intervention right there. And not being afraid to do that. The problems we generally have in sport and preparation are not generally that we did not enough training. It's that we made mistakes by doing too much. Particularly high intensity, which I'll talk about more. I always like to put up this just to counter most of the information you probably get all the time, which is about this stuff. Specificity, our ability to measure training now has created this push towards specificity. Specificity meaning we must make our training like racing. And obviously there's a certain amount of that is true, but if we take it to the extreme, for example, we're doing training sessions that have far too much loading. And then it comes back to consistency. They can't recover enough. It's the same reason why if you're a 10K runner, you don't run 10K at race pace every training session. But we have that trend pushing to us towards specificity. In fact, we had the Rotterdam Grand Final for the elite athletes. You maybe watched that. And there was about 140 corners during that race. So there's a temptation, for example, to want to make a lot of workouts that have that many corners to be specific. But in fact, if you did a session that was very similar to Rotterdam, it would be very hard to put that into a program along with everything else because the session load would be really, really high. Could affect consistency, so we have to make those decisions. I like to put speed on here because our sport is not one of speed. It's about strength and endurance. But it's very tempting to want to go in this speed direction. Our athletes have to be fast. There are moments of the race where that's true, but it's not the norm for us. Our athletes need to be able to withstand a 2-hour race or a 1-hour race. They're basically the same. We shouldn't, calling it a sprint is not really correct. But our athletes don't need to be fast. The top speeds that our top athletes are doing in the race, instantaneous top speeds, are attainable by pretty much every junior even, right? The ability to run 1K at the same speed as Javi Gomez, we can take a junior to the track and they can probably do it, the 10K speed, right? So right away we can see that's not what our sport is about. Our sport is doing that at the end, but we can overdo it. Measurement, it's so easy to measure everything. Data now, it's very easy to be overwhelmed by the amount of data we can generate, and that has a risk of just confusing the situation. Technique, I put this on here, understanding there is some of our sport that's important for technique, but we, again, overdo it. And that's the message I want to, again, drive home. Overdoing these things. Underdoing the basics. Recovery modality is very popular to have selling a lot of devices and all of these things. I mean, time and rest, still sleep, but the best recovery. We don't need to spend a lot of money on recovery. Innovation, again, the accessibility of this. Most of us don't work in an environment where we can afford these kind of things. And I want to say we don't need them either. Okay, some meat and potatoes about how I organize the season and how I think about it. So that's a screenshot from Training Peaks that I've been using for a long time, and now is a sponsor of the Federation. In fact, many of our athletes now using Training Peaks. The beauty of that is I didn't have to design that. That was automatically produced based on what we did. There's nothing particularly special about that. If you want to look in general, 1,030 hours, it's normal, standard. But that's an actual trace of the season. And the parts I want to emphasize are just this preparation period. And in this, you could say, I say there's 3 phases, but you could think of this as a double periodization, where we have this long block in the winter before the first red race, before Abu Dhabi, in fact. And then we have another one, May to July. And this particular one, the athlete was the winner of both of those races immediately following the long period of training. But the success of the season and the success of our work is coming from those periods. And I talk about what those periods comprise of, but I can't emphasize enough the quality of the work that we do in the winter. Quality not meaning intensity, but the consistency of approach in the winter, and then revisiting that in the spring, summer, is the foundation of that success. Like when sometimes we look at training plans and there's way more red bars, there's way more races, and you start to see how can they be doing the work if they're always racing and traveling. And it comes back to, well, they're not, and they're not improving. And that's probably the difference maker with season planning is, if you race all the time, you can stay at the same level. But if you want to improve, you've got to invest in your preparation significantly. So the specific preparation, the typical race pace threshold, the kind of stuff that you think about, let's get ready to race. Every year I do less and less of that. So you might think, before big races, we need to, especially before the first one, used to do maybe 6 weeks of specific preparation, then 4 weeks, then 2 weeks. Shorter and shorter, because I think we actually need less and less. Again, I think we overdo it. How many times does Mario Mola run off the bike before he wins Abu Dhabi? Twice. That's it. He's capable, the very first time we run off the bike in March, he can already run way faster than he needs to in the race. So it tells me we're not training anything there. In fact, we have to be careful of those moments, because those are the kind of moments that can bite us by overreaching in those particular periods, those particular session moments. So this specific preparation gets shorter and shorter over time. And then the competition phase, that's when you're in between races. What do you do in between races to maintain form, if you like, from the first red line B to the last one? What do we do in that period? We try to maintain what we're doing. We're not reaching for more. We're just trying to maintain a level. So we often do very little, actually. That's why we need that period, again, second half of the season. Now, it's not possible for every athlete to follow a periodization that looks like this, but take away the principles, consistent winter preparation, revisit that in the season. If you want to be good at the end of the season, and you never come back to those bars over here, if you never come back to these, you're going to struggle to be good at the end of the season. And we see that all the time. Athletes start great, fade, 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 and not only physically fade, but mentally fade. They get tired of doing intensity, tired of doing specificity. And having the courage to just step away from that is very powerful. That's more or less what I've just said there. Maintenance of volume and frequency. Balanced number of races and training. The closer we got to the Rio Games, the fewer races we tended to do. But we can apply that to every level. This is a different year, obviously, different color. same principle, 2016, 2017. So I think learning, well, partly for us, but equally, so the things that we stopped doing, for example, stop doing the French Grand Prix, stop doing the Bundesliga, more focus on training. And if there's one thing that we can learn to do, is to be very confident going into a major event with no other competitions preceding it. And I think many of our athletes are not confident at all in that environment. We think we must have races. The problem is there's a risk when we race. Now, of course, near the end of the season, there's a lot of red lines. That's the reality of the Senior World Series. But we can make choices, particularly at the development level. We make choices about what they do. They can follow different paths. They don't have to race all the time. But I would like our athletes to become more confident to arrive at the first race or arrive after a period of training, ready to go. We can experiment with that. And I have the benefit of having experimented with it, but I know it can be done because we've repeated it almost actually every year the last 5 years. So we have that benefit, but I can share that with you, is that I feel quite confident arriving after 4 months of the winter, ready to expect our athletes to win because we've done the work. We're confident because we've done the work. Training plan prioritizing the fundamentals, just coming back to that. Strength, endurance, frequency. It's not a lot of high intensity, it's a lot of consistency. So these are some errors that I see, that I have made every one of these. That's where I've learned. But it's also a reflection of what I see. Too many races. One of my big principles, bugbears, won't be able to translate that probably. But the principle is racing during the off season. Not a good idea. In fact, when I see athletes running personal bests in January, February, for example, it's very common to do 10Ks, 5Ks, do a running focus. I often see athletes doing lifetime bests in that period. And I think, how can you be at your best when it really matters if you're at your best now in January or February? And the answer is you can't. And we often see athletes never come back to that level of performance. And what they end up doing is compromising the winter training in order to chase these specific goals. So they're not actually having a period of building, they're having a period already withdrawing. We think of that. Deposit in the bank, withdraw from the bank. If you want to be able to withdraw something when you race, you better deposit a lot, especially if it's important. Poor mix of events. Every coach deals with this because our sport is not one where we have a really clear path of which races you should do. We have the benefit of many choices, from youth to junior to senior. Yeah, you can chart your own course. The only path really is when you reach the very top level, and then the Senior World Series is your path. But that's 10 athletes in the world, maybe. The rest of us, we face this challenge of how do we find the right mix? And I see both of these. Racing events that are too low for the level of the athlete, or too high. And the classic example is when we see, world level athletes racing a lot of small local age group races, just disconnected from the reality of both the demands of the sport, but also the requirement of preparation. And for me, that's about opportunity cost. What do you give up by doing this other choice? What are you not doing? And what you're not doing when you're traveling through the country to a small race is you're not doing the long ride, the long run, the big volume. You can't do it. If you try to do it, you're going to find that consistency starts to fall down because inevitably they can't recover from that. Too high, we want our athletes to aim high. We want our athletes to aspire and believe they can be competing with the best. But if they're always in too high of a level of race for their current level, then they're going to struggle to really develop. And again, we're fortunate in our sport, we have multiple levels that we can compete in. Lack of focus on major events. How often do we see our athletes arrive at the World Championships, European Championships, not really ready to perform? Why is that? Did they focus enough? Were they willing to take the risk to put the focus on that race? How many times did they race and travel in the 2 months before that? Often it's in hindsight, but we can look back and see we probably weren't going to get the performance we wanted at that race, and it's obvious in hindsight. But we need to be better at predicting that and have the confidence to put our eggs in the championship basket. Training through races, I'm not a fan of this principle. I don't like it. And I'll tell you why. It's because the psychology impact of that. If you go into a race tired because you did a lot of work as you're training through, the chances of a bad performance, bad relative performance, are relatively high. Athletes do not like not performing to their expectations. You're taking a huge risk with their psychology if you go into the race tired. And in fact, we don't need to, for all the reasons I was just saying. We can be very confident to go in ready to perform without racing beforehand. But what I see is a lot of our athletes, and probably a lot of us, are not so confident yet to do that. We think we need races. We don't. The other alternative is you train through a race, but you really do rest, and you taper for a small race that's not important. Then you come back to consistency. You're not going to see all of those nice blue or gray bars stacked up nicely high if you've actually rested for a race that's not important. Too much intensity, I talked about this, but it's a major thing that I see over and over globally. Too much intensity for too long. It burns our athletes. It's not what we need to get better. But it's very tempting because we want to be confident by the quality of our training. And when I say quality now, I mean how fast we're going. We all do it. I still have to fight myself every day to not search for confidence from training. Meaning, we do not need to have the best training we've ever had prior to the best races we're going to have. A lot of our athletes and a lot of us, we connect those two things. If I'm going to go win the World Championships, I need to have World Champion training before. Wrong. And in fact, if you see that, be very careful. Whenever I see athletes having the best training they've ever had, the highest quality, fastest, I know there's a high chance something's going to go wrong very soon because they're spending too much energy, they're pushing too hard, and we arrive at races and we find there's nothing. Everybody, I'm sure, can identify with that. Every athlete can identify with that. We must have the discipline to keep controlled during our preparation, right? And we have to set limits in our preparation. Where that comes from, the confidence to do that, is to know, again, what I talked about at the beginning, what's important here. Consistency, endurance, strength. Where does that come from? It comes from doing a little bit every day. It doesn't come from doing monster sessions. And the other way to illustrate that is, if we take a low-level athlete, or a lowish level athlete, and we get them to train with a high-level athlete, typically, we'll adjust for levels, but typically they can last a few days. They can do the same sessions as the world champion for a few days. But then they get tired and they can't continue. And what's the difference there? The resistance to be able to continue to do that for weeks and weeks and weeks, months and months. It's not big sessions that make champions, it's consistency over time. On the annual plan, notice there's not 1, 2, 3 rest, 1, 2, 3 rest. It's more or less straight across. There are no recovery weeks because we adapt the load to do it every single week, day after day, week after week. So that's the difference of what I mean by quality off-season. If your training load is so high that you need regular recovery weeks, it's too high. Just bring it down a little bit and stretch it out. That's what consistency looks like. The last one I can see, we've just had athletes go through some races in Asia, Japan, fresh on my mind. We need to be really good with having clear race week plans. It's a real easy win for us to change with many of our athletes. I see many of our athletes who do not know what to do the week of the race. In fact, many coaches, perhaps it comes where maybe we're not so confident, so we're going to let the athlete do what they feel like doing. The instincts of the athletes are usually wrong race week. Psychology makes us want to do the opposite of what we need. If we're tired race week, for example, probably you're not going to perform if you do less. But our instinct is to want to do less and less intensity. If we feel good, we probably should do less. So we get it backwards often. The better we get at race week plans, I think the more consistent our athletes will perform. Most of my athletes do the same race week plan for every single race. It doesn't really change very much. If we travel one day, we'll adapt it a little bit, but it's the same. It's predictable, consistent, they know what to do. They're not dependent on how they feel. How athletes feel race week is a psychological construct that may or may not be related to physiology. So the more we understand that, the better. Just a snapshot of an annual plan for 2016, going into Rio. The point I want to make with this, it's not necessarily applicable to every environment, but we want you to see the amount of time we spend in training camps. So this particular year, not even sure that that's 100% accurate. There's a period between Gold Coast and Cape Town where we were, it says home or Stellenbosch, we were in South Africa. So 29 weeks, most of the year, more than half of the year, we're living out of a suitcase. And I had an athlete recently who's training in Colorado and Boulder, and contrasting the challenge for us between home training environments and training camp environments. And we kind of know because everyone in here I'm sure does some training camps sometimes, and you know what's different about it. All you do is train, eat, sleep, train. And the challenge for us at home is how do we maintain that level of focus? And the reality is you can't do 100% of that focus. But I illustrate the power of this amount of time where you're only eat, sleep, train. There's nothing else happening. There are no holidays, we don't even take days off, really. But that's very powerful. And again, what are the best doing? They're spending a lot of time in this environment. Not every champion is doing this, but just to illustrate, this is one way. The athletes in Leeds, they live and train in Leeds. They also go away for camps, but that focus, if we can capture some of that focus at home, we're going to do better. 9 races. That's what was on that. So not so many. And count how many races our athletes are doing. It's often quite high. Only 9. We covered most of these things now. I'll talk about a couple of the other things. The other factors that we need to consider, they're not really 1%ers, but the other factors that we need our athletes to be good at. Start speed in the water, open water skills. Bike skills and tactical awareness has changed significantly over the last years. Again, reference Rotterdam, 140 corners. This is very different than the old days of out and back along a beach. We have to adapt to that. We have to be prepared for that. And that comes back to junior, youth. If there's one thing that we can do better, start early, is get our athletes very comfortable handling their bikes, right? It's very hard to teach older athletes to be very comfortable on their bike because they have fear. And every coach that's tried to change an athlete's perception of fear knows how difficult that is. So the more we can get our athletes to be highly skilled on bikes, comfortable on bikes, cyclocross, mountain bike, road bike, everything at young ages, the better. And we see the impact of somebody like Flora Duffy, current senior women's world champion. She's changed the races this year because she's so good technically and strength-wise, but particularly technically, she's so good. It's changed the races. And we've got to adapt and anticipate that. And we can start young. Transition skills, maybe it goes without saying, it's not a technical skill, more an attitude and mentality. I think I've got a slide somewhere of last week in Korea. We had Greg Barnaby, first out of transition 2. I like this attitude. We've got to attack the race. So it's not a skill thing there. That was a decision that an athlete made. That's what we want, right? And we can prepare them to do that. Finishing speed, it's not really that important. It is our 1%. I would say that the finishing speed that our athletes are doing, the top athletes are doing, it's not that fast. You have to reach 9.8K. So we shouldn't worry too much about how fast they can sprint 200, because it really doesn't matter unless they're actually arriving there at the end. And really the max speed's maybe 60 seconds per 400. Maybe Jake Burtwhistle from Australia's got a little bit more. If you watched Edmonton when he misused his speed and attacked with 1 lap to go. But okay, I have 2 microcycle templates that I've used and adapted over time. This is more or less what we do every week. There are no days off. It changes as preparation season, higher volume, higher frequency, 3 days of double running, cycling almost every day, cycling 5. This is not a difference maker, but the pattern that I've developed that I use is more the interaction between the 3. That's the principle that I think is important there. How do we connect the 3 sports? And then we change to preparation season. So it's a little different. Now Mondays are a little bit more recovery. Fridays a little bit more recovery on the bike. Volume goes down a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. Intensity goes up a little bit. But again, this is short time of the year. So this is what I'm doing. So if somebody said, if you take a day off every week, and maybe it's obvious, just do the math. We never take days off. Always something easy. But if you take a day off every week, you've lost a month and a half in 1 year, more or less. Difference, right? I think it's a mentality. We're here to work, we can work every day. Our athletes are conditioned enough to do something every day. This is stuff that's changed, or principles that I've learned over time, and we've covered a lot of these. Save your bullets. That really comes back to, do you have energy to race big at the important races? Coming back to, are you spending that energy in training, being training world champion? We know a lot of those. Or at the wrong races, right? So I much more save that. Think about that in your training, your selection of races. Don't fire your bullets at the wrong time. Save them for the big races. And we often see, when we watch them, I don't know how many had a look at the results from Japan this morning, it's often very small differences that totally change the race. And in order to be ready to not have those small differences go in the wrong way, we have to have the energy. And you don't know what the difference maker is going to be. It could be something very small. A few seconds here, a few seconds there, the race is different. We have to be ready, charged up. Individual approaches, confidence in less. The more time I've got on, the more confident I am in doing less, high intensity in particular, but less in general. Tend not to worry too much if we miss something. But I know there's that drive, questioning yourself, do I do enough? Am my athlete training enough? Are they working hard enough? So over time, I'm more confident to say, enough is enough. And there's just this principle of when in doubt, leave it out. I don't know how that translates. Obviously, if you know English, it rhymes. But those doubts that we have about our training, like athletes got a little niggle, a little pain. How often do we have the confidence to say, you know what, we're not going to do whatever we're going to do, we're going to change it because of this pain. usually your instinct is right. If your instinct is to follow the program, have a think about that, because those are the critical moments where we make mistakes. It's in those little moments, I've got a little bit of pain, but I really want to do this important session. But there is no session that's that important that it's worth risking injury for. But we battle that confidence, that ego, that I need to follow the plan. But our instincts are often wrong in that case. And we can train ourselves to make better decisions. And in fact, what we really want to do is train our athletes to be able to make that decision. We want them to say, I don't think I can do this session, or I'm not feeling right. And to have the courage to say to us as coaches, and then as soon as you hear that, most athletes, as soon as you hear that, you know it's probably worse than they're saying. And so you need to back off. Those kind of moments, every coach can think of many examples like that. Probably every week there's something like that. The better we get at handling those decisions, the more likely we're going to be consistent over time. The last point, perfection in training, it doesn't exist. There's never a time where I think, oh, we did everything that I wanted to do. It doesn't exist. There's always something that comes up. And the more we understand, we don't need that. We don't need perfection. I don't know how I'm doing for time here, but I'm just going to roll on. Training distribution. Early in my career of coaching, we did a lot of focus phases. Meaning we're going to focus on one discipline, say in the winter, a lot of swimming or a lot of biking. And I never found that translated as well as I hoped. And over time, the more I realized that what we need is balanced swim, bike, run. We need to be our best in each sport at the same time. It's no use being good in one, but we didn't, great swimming focus, but I'm not fit enough in the bike to stay in the pack, or not fit enough to run well off of that bike because I didn't bike enough, because it was focused too much on swimming. So I come back to that balance, and we know what do our champions in our sport look like. They're very good across all three. More and more, you can't have a weakness. You have to be good at everything. And that comes back to our preparation. How do we structure our preparation to do that? It's not easy, I'll give you that. It's not easy to do that, but if we have that mentality, we're on the right track. And this last one, not the last one, the middle one here, paying very close to the interaction between swim, bike, and run. This is our challenge and the beauty of triathlon coaching. Triathlon coaching in the model where you as a triathlon coach all three sports. This is the art of coaching. There's a science to it, but the art of coaching is the interaction of those three. That's where I think the real skill is understanding the connection between the three. So when I'm on camp, we know we were on the track, let's say we're on camp Wednesday morning at the pool. We know we were on the track yesterday. I'm watching to see how did they come out of that track session. Are they tired today, more than I expect? Connecting those three, that happens all the time. If we want to do a quality session, but we're finding an interaction, for example, between how we've put together the week, we might not be able to do what we want to do. Particularly connect between swimming and running. But in a high level swim, bike, run, you can see that interaction. If you try to do a high quality session under heavy fatigue, you're probably not going to be able to achieve what you wanted to. So we have to connect our program in that way. And particularly, we've got different kinds of athletes, but very common now are really good runners, we see some of these, that need to improve their swimming. And we've got to be confident in order to reduce the level of run training so that they can have more energy to swim well more often, knowing that they're still probably going to run pretty well. But that interaction is really interesting to me, and it's constantly, I think, changing, and you have to look for that connection, look for that feedback in between the three. And this optimal individual loading, I think we've touched on that. But what is the right loading stress level for each athlete? Stress in terms of training, stress, adaptation. What is the right level? Because every athlete is different. Although as I say that, they're more the same than they are different. But there's subtleties. And the better we understand that, the more successful our athletes are going to be. This concept of minimal effective dose, I think, is important. And I'll contrast that with, we have to do a lot of training, a lot of work, but at the same time, we're looking for this minimal effective dose. What is the smallest dose of training that elicits the response we want? It's not the maximum effective dose. We don't want the most training that they can possibly do. We want the minimum that they can do in order to get the kind of response we want. That's likely an approach that's going to achieve consistency. And it changes over time. This is not static. Over time, our athletes get better at their ability to handle greater and greater training loads. And then the minimal effective dose changes. And we have to change with them. And I see this in action sometimes because our athletes have quite fixed ideas about themselves. I can only bike 10 hours a week. If I bike more than 10 hours a week, X happens. But that's a real fixed mindset. That can change. I'm very confident that those kind of things can change. But this principle is important. The management of intensive sessions is probably the key part of our training plan design. Do less intensity than you think you need. Just do less and you're probably going to be on the right track. And this concept of optimal load is what you can absorb. We know a lot of athletes who are surviving training, but they're not really absorbing it. They're not getting better from it, they're just surviving. And then those are the kind of athletes, they arrive at the races with nothing. They're empty when they arrive, because they only survived. So that's too much then. So that principle, the right training load for the individual, is what they can adapt to. What stimulus do they respond to? Too much doesn't work. Too little, of course, if we don't train enough, we're not going to be really on the track to world class. And these progressions meaning we design training sessions that get a little bit more, that grow. But keep it really simple, I think. Keep it simple. Again, success is not coming from very complex training sessions. I like this quote because there's a lot of what we do and a lot of science and information about training monitoring. And it always comes back to this principle for me is coaches that pay attention. It's still the best way to monitor the impact of training on our athletes, watching the athletes. If you can learn to understand and see body language, you're doing very well, because that tells me almost everything I need to know. Body language and mood. I don't need anything else. If I can say a few words to the athlete, get a sense of their mood, that's probably the highest predictor. And then you can know by body language. And I have the test that I always come back to is the speed with which they walk to the pool from their car. Or the slower they walk, the more tired they are. You can see it. It's very reliable. But these points are actually really important because you can make it very complicated. And in fact, there are meta-analysis of different ways of measuring recovery. You know, HRV, morning heart rate, hydration. But when we study all of these, we still come back to the athlete's subjective response to training is the best predictor of their readiness to train again. So we can learn to do that. That's accessible to everybody. You don't need any budget. You don't need any tools. You can learn to get better at that. And it's constantly, you never stop. You never figure it out. You have to keep paying attention, keep awareness. And again, the power of seeing your athletes every day. Many of us, of course, coach via distance a lot of the time. But you can learn also the cues via distance. It's not the best, but you can detect mood and communication style via text and WhatsApp and You can learn to do that as well. It's not as good though. That's the power of being in the same place. You're more likely to miss the cues in that environment than you are in person. And coming back to these high-level principles, self-management. We want the athlete to monitor themselves and to know themselves when they're ready to train. They're going to have doubts, of course. That's part of the role that we have. But the better they get at that, the more problems we're going to avoid. There's an expression, the athlete can feel, but they can't see. And we as coaches can see, but we can't feel. So we connect together, and that's how we navigate this process of training load. And of course, training logs are very useful for this, because they force a reflection moment. It's very easy to let this one slip, but you know, athletes that spend a few minutes, and even for coaches it's very good practice. How did the training day go? What comments come to mind when you think about it? And writing those down. Very powerful. And of course we know in general when an athlete is struggling, they're more reluctant to do that. So it's also a cue when the training peaks updates stop coming, you know there's probably something wrong. Right? They're not engaging in reflection because something is not right. So we have cues there even. I was asked to put some slides, not for here, but in general, because we're fortunate to have some of the best runners in the world. 2 slides about running. I've said, and I was challenged by one of my athletes about this. Do you really believe in swim for show, run for dough, run for cash? You know, dough doesn't translate really. Of course, swim is important, the bike is very important. But if there's a message for all of us in developing, if we want to see an Italian Olympic champion, it's going to be somebody that runs very fast. And we have to be thinking like that. How do we develop athletes to run at the level required to win? And the standard, the challenge we have in every Western country, you can say, is the same, is our pool as a nation of athletes who are actually fast enough to compete with Mario and Alistair and Javi is very small. Let's say the gold medal standard, like we saw when Alistair did, I think it was the Stanford 10K a few years ago, and he ran 28:30. Not a track runner, but he ran 28:30. No particular focus, just, I'm going to do a track race. I think it was after the San Diego World Series. The next week or the next, that's a pretty high standard. How many men do we have who are runners who are at that level? There's not a lot. But that's what we need. That's the global standard. How are we going to A, develop athletes that can do that, and B, attract, identify those kind of athletes who might come into triathlon? So we might develop, attract. So for running, you see the same things over and over again. Consistent workload over time. Don't have interruptions due to injury. Don't have interruptions due to illness. Running, as we know, is the easiest to get injuries and problems. So this is the most important to pay attention. Hills. Hills are the best thing that we can get our athletes to do. More hills, all the time, more hills. It's the best drill there is, running uphill. And keep it as simple as that. Read Arthur Lydiard's stuff. If you want to study coaching, study Arthur Lydiard from New Zealand. The Waitakere Range is outside of Auckland. Hills, hills, hills. That's what all they do. And it's the drill that I do. More. If you have to drive down or do it on a treadmill so you don't get the downhill at the beginning, but hills. Just frequency and general endurance. Running a lot. Alistair in Leeds, Johnny, they get into trouble a little bit with this, but they run every single day when they're healthy. It's not right for everybody, but you can imagine over time, go back to that picture of Alistair when he's 12, he's done more than a decade of running every single day, and that adds up. But the way you do it is you take it easy. A lot of the time it's very, very easy. In fact, when I was working in Britain, I did a lot of running with Alistair and Johnny, and I have zero talent. But I could run long runs with them. We run 5 minutes per K. Same with Mario, same with Rich Murray is even more, we call African style. Run as slow as you want. You're not going to hurt yourself running very slow. Only your ego. But then you can run more often. The training is very simple, progressions, tempo, there's no secrets there. It's just the dosing. How much do you do? And do less. That's what I want to say. Do less than you think. Almost everybody is overdoing it. Speeds must always be in control. This is one thing I have to remind myself over and over. Do not let the athletes run as fast as they want. They will run too fast. We know Pepe is sitting over there, where we work every day. These are the source of all of our problems, is when we fail to put limits on the athletes' running speeds for training sessions. If we say run 3:10 per K for whatever, then if they're running faster than that, you must stop them. Because this is where the problems come from. We don't have the courage to stop them when we can see that they're doing on the wrong track. And it's connecting that the wrong track is often too fast. It's not, our ego wants us to believe it's the opposite, that you must go faster all the time, faster, faster, faster. Wrong. We need to be in control. We know more or less, there's different ways to do this. But you can imagine, Jack Daniels got this VDOT running formula based on VO2 max. It's a good proxy for this, or the Macmillan running formula, another one. Plug in your personal bests over different durations, and it programs more or less different speeds. I find these pretty good. I use these a lot. Most of the time it stays the same. It doesn't change very much. But just to give you a reference, because what we're trying to do with our run training is a certain amount of stimulus, and then we get a response from it. But more stimulus is not better. As long as if we say we want to do VO2 max run training, we need to be in the range. But it's not a specific number, it's a range. If we want to do race pace, it's in a range. If we want to do endurance training, it's in a range. It doesn't matter if it's 4:45 per kilometer or 5 minutes. That's not so important. It does matter if you're trying to run your long endurance runs much too fast. That's pretty common. But it's in a range. We don't need to be exact. So the biggest sessions we're doing, again, I'm repeating myself over and over, but it's not the size of the running sessions. The amount of volume. We never run 10 by a K, for example, standard Olympic distance. Never. It's too much, in my opinion. It's too much. Do less. At race pace. If you're doing less than race pace, yeah, you can do more. But do less. We rarely run on the track until February, March. That's a little different than the leagues program. They tend to start track in November, but I prefer to save that for later. I think we can use fartlek and different things to stay in contact with over race pace. But the track sessions are short, for the most part, short. Don't bother running fast off the bike too often. With the women a little bit more, but it's more related to psychology than physiology. But the guys, again, I find for the most part, they're not training anything when they're running fast off the bike. They can already do it. If in one training session you demonstrate more than the capacity you need to race, that gives you a clue that that training session isn't what you need to do. Now, if you take an athlete and you say, we're going to run 1K off the bike at your race pace, and they can't do it, that tells you something too, but it's not actually the running off the bike is the problem. Actually, the race pace is wrong and not fit enough. Minimal race pace. I write this again when we come back to the planning of the year, that our periods of specific focus are short. And I like this concept. There's an American that works in Norway called Stephen Seiler, who has studied this kind of stuff, and he had this concept which I like, which is race pace intensity is toxic. Too much makes you sick, more or less. So we should use it sparingly. And then that reconditioning, that's that June period when we come back to the annual planning. So I just have one slide on psychology, but then I've written it's the biggest and most important issue. And I say that because psychology is connected to everything we do as a coach. The way that we communicate with athletes is it's psychology. The messages that we send, what we reinforce or what we punish is about psychology. And we know that confidence is so important for our athletes to achieve their potential. And so we have to think of our coaching as not physiological methodology. It's connecting, communication, how we communicate, understanding that the messages we give to our athletes have such a strong impact on them. And the moments where it's most important are when things start to go wrong. These are the critical moments for us. How do we behave if an athlete has a bad training session? Has a massive impact. We can influence what they think about a good or bad training session by the way that we communicate at those critical moments. And the better that we get at recognizing them, the better we can operate as coaches, the more effective we're going to be. So if we reward, for example, connecting psychology to what I just talked about with running, if we reward running that's too fast, we're sending the wrong message, right? And the opposite side of that is if we punish athletes that can't complete a session that we designed, we're also sending the wrong message. If an athlete can't do the session that you designed, it's your fault for not recognizing it. And the better we take responsibility for that, the more effective we're going to be as coaches. It means that you weren't able to anticipate from body language, communication, relationship, that they weren't able to do what you thought that they could do. That's a learning point for you as a coach. But how we deal with that is really important. Those are critical moments in our relationship with athletes. And we see this come into play a lot on race weeks. We want to project calm, confidence, no drama, reinforcing the basics routine on race week. I see many coaches who get drawn into the emotion of race week. They become very connected to what the athletes say that they feel. And the athletes feed off of us. If we're stressed, they will pick up on that and become stressed. If we're calm and confident, they will see that and become more confident and calm. So I say everything is psychology. And I like this picture of Ale, because with this particular athlete, know the athlete, but that emotional management and management of confidence is a really important part of his process. And we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about that, management of ego, management of expectations. And when Ale started to train with Mario and Rich and some of the guys this year, there was quite a big change for him that connects back to our culture stuff that we'll talk about this afternoon. And he went from an environment of being the best all the time to never being the best in training. And that's really hard for an athlete to manage and process, but it's been a challenge for him to grow as an athlete. To disconnect from, I need to dominate all my training partners, to actually, I need to manage myself really well, or I'm going to get crushed by my training partners. But that skill to manage yourself, again, come back to where did we start this morning? Was learning how to manage that is critical to your success and development of athletes. So this has been part of his process, but indeed it's part of every athlete's process. Everyone's just a little different in how close to the surface their emotions are and their ego is. But you know, when we get this right, athletes stand on the start line, confident, ready to play. And I contrast, this is a story of Simon Whitfield, who was gold medalist in Sydney, as you know, maybe know. And when he went to Athens to defend his title 4 years later, he did it with the pressure of trying to defend. And when he recounts the difference between Sydney, Athens, and Beijing, on Sydney's start line, he was full of joy and ready to get after it. In Athens, he was full of fear and almost not paralyzed with fear, but had the wrong mental state, not confident. And the transformation for him to Beijing was standing on the start line of the Olympic Games, making jokes with the other athletes, ready to play. That's a sign of real confidence and the right approach. And the more we can find that, because that's, again, it's connected to everything we do every day, we process that, we can influence that, how they see competition. Are you confident from the work you've done and ready to play? And I think that's what you see there. And there are some challenges and differences between males and females about confidence. And I think the better we understand that, the better we can work individually with each group. What's become more clear to me over time is the specificity rehearsal aspects of our preparation can have a really big difference for our female athletes. It's maybe not so much because they're physiologically training better, but they're more confident that they've repeated the process enough times that they can execute that. So over time, particularly with athletes who are low on confidence, we try to create opportunities to rehearse situations often so that when they arrive at the race, they know they've done 100 transitions or whatever it is prior to the race. So that's not because it was the right training effect, physiological training, but for a psychological training effect. In general, I've found most males don't have the same need or don't respond quite the same way that some women do. Okay, almost at the end here. Honestly, I like this quote because it fits everything.